It provides a cultural opportunity for students as well as the community to explore the rich heritage of St. Bernard and the New Orleans area. Welcome to the Nunez History Lecture Series. It's great to see such a big crowd. The topic tonight, the history of Jackson Barracks, fulfills many of the missions of the lecture series, bringing local history to light, joining the two institutions and bringing all that together. So it's going to be a particularly good one. We have a little bit of news going on. It's towards the end of our season, and so it's time to look forward to next year. So we're going to be choosing topics. The board of directors will be choosing topics for next year later on this month. You might have noticed out on the tables there, we're listing a compilation of the topics that you have said you've wanted. There's still time to figure that out, and so there are also some blank sheets. We'd appreciate it if you'd rank the topics for next year and get those back, say, in the next couple weeks, so that when the board comes together, we can figure things out. We do our very best to do what you choose, and of course, then the next step is to look for speakers and some other things. So it should be it'll be our 5th season already, so we look forward to it. Also, I shouldn't mention this, but those of you who are veterans know that last year there was a situation where I had just mentioned after 25 or 30 lectures that we had never had a lecture miss, and how proud I was of that. Ron Chapman, who's involved with the lecture series quite a bit, happened to be in the audience, and his face just dropped, all right, because of the gree quotient. And of course, that afternoon, not 1 hour later, the lecturer called and said he couldn't be there, all right? But so I waited until I saw Colonel Pugh, who is here today. So the gree quotient only has one more possibility to mess up, and so I'm taking chance. But since we've gone this whole year where I haven't had to give a lecture, and since we've been doing this enough, you become like family, there is one thing that I'm going to do right after the opening act next time, and I'm not going to tell you what it is, but it's the one thing in this world that I do well. All right, I'll give you a hint. It has to do with fruit, and it's circus-like. All right, and it's the one thing that I do that is truly impressive. All right, so people tell me. All right, so that's sad for the rest of my life, but at least I'm going to do this at the opening act because I haven't had to, it's only fair that I do something as well. And so you'll have to come in May to see that. So it should be a good thing, all right? And so now, probably the reason you're here, though, I'm sorry about that, Colonel Pugh, but it's also, I think the reason everybody's here is for the introduction of the mascot, all right? And so you'll find out about that. There you go. We've been working for months and months on this. We have a very elaborate slide presentation to list all the different things that we've gone through to have them before we get to a great slide of the final presentation. So right now, let me do the slide presentation, but I'll tell you, I'm kind of embarrassed by this. I seem to be having some problem. Could you do the spotlight a little bit wider so I can see what I'm doing here? All right, no, I guess I can't. I tell you, instead of let's have the real thing. So let's. All right, and that is also, more importantly, for those of you who don't know, this is my child, Chloe. She just turned a year old, and this is my wife, Lonnie. So they've been a big part of it. And for those of you who are just coming for the first time, she's kind of grown with this season. She was a mascot earlier. We've changed models many times, and we just in the last couple weeks got a model that had motion to it. So we thought that's why we waited for the formal introduction. All right. So, but now let's get on to the evening's entertainment. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Tommy Warner, who's the Chancellor of Nunez Community College, to give an introduction of our speaker for tonight.
Thank you, Curtis. Isn't it tough to follow him? More likely, it's more tough to follow Chloe and Mama back there. So we want to first of all thank everybody for coming to our lecture series as you usually do. We really appreciate it. This is your series. It's not ours. It's a great crowd tonight. The only one, I believe, that's one of the few in the state of Louisiana where they have a history lecture series like this. Sometimes they have them in the library somewhere where they have maybe 10 or 15 people. But this has really grown strong, and we have a number of topics to go over during the next couple of years, and we hope that that'll take place. Thanks to all of you. You make it possible. And, of course, thanks to Curtis Manning and his sidekick, Ron Chapin. They do a tremendous job for us. Tonight, I'm going to get off the stage because you're here for something else. I just want to let you know that tonight, as Mr. Brian Keating, who's a Vietnamese veteran, said, you have a full bird coming up here. So tonight the speaker is Colonel John Pugh. He is a native of Thibodaux. He graduated from LSU in history, has a law degree, and is now practicing law in Thibodaux. In the meantime, he works at the Jackson Barracks. He's the executive consul, and I think he's the historian for Jackson Barracks. So without further ado, Colonel John Pugh. Thank you, John, for coming here.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am one of these people that when you reach a certain age, you get computer illiterate, and I'm not sure that I'm going to do this the way it's supposed to be done, but I have my wife here who is the computer expert who is ready to criticize when I don't do it correctly. Dr. Warner, thank you very much for inviting me. On behalf of Major General Bennett Landreneau, the Adjutant General of the state of Louisiana, he asked that I tell you how much we appreciate the St. Bernard community and its support of Jackson Barracks. I'm sure that most of you know that the vast majority of our employees live in St. Bernard Parish, even though we are in fact the last piece of Orleans Parish before we reach your lovely parish. The majority of our people live here in St. Bernard, and we have a great affinity with St. Bernardans, and we hope that our participation in this will strengthen the sense of community that we have with the people of the parish. Our kids go to school in St. Bernard Parish, and we obviously shop there, and although we are Orleanians, I think our love and our affinity is here. We also welcome you to come and to visit us at Jackson Barracks. Tonight, a couple of people mentioned how sorry they were that since 9/11 they've been unable to visit, and that's not exactly the case. We have increased security, which basically means someone will stop and ask for a picture ID, but you're welcome to visit Jackson Barracks to see our museum, to see our library and do genealogical research, or in fact to see the beautiful barracks that it is. I can't believe that St. Bernardans would not know of Jackson Barracks and have visited there, but just in case you don't know of the actual beauty of it, perhaps some of the pictures that I will show you will do that justice. You know, an awful lot of people ask me, they said, you know, why was Jackson Barracks built? Why is it where it was? And people give reasons for, well, we were building Jackson Barracks in anticipation of the War of 1812, we were building Jackson Barracks in anticipation of the Civil War, and so on. Jackson Barracks was built as a direct result of the War of 1812, but maybe not for the reasons that people think. If you remember from the War of 1812, New Orleans was almost captured Fierce battle right here in St. Bernard Parish. Washington was sacked. Baltimore was attacked. Francis Scott Key wrote the Star-Spangled Banner during the bombing of Fort McHenry. So after the War of 1812, Congress decided that all of the coastal cities of the country were not adequately defended, and they vowed to never have those kinds of crisis situations that occurred in Baltimore, Washington, New Orleans, occur again. So Congress passed what was known as the Federal Fortification Acts, which dictated the construction of forts or fort-like structures all along the Atlantic and the Gulf seacoasts. Most of the installations, old forts that you know of, Fort Monroe in Norfolk, Virginia, the fort at Savannah, Fort Pulaski, the fort at Mobile, Fort Morgan, the fort off of Mississippi that is erroneously called Fort Massachusetts, but the coastal fort of Gulfport, Biloxi, as well as the forts, most of which are in St. Bernard Parish, Pike, Macomb. Fort St. Philip was being constructed along the river. That was finished, and Fort Jackson was constructed. We also built Fort Livingston off of Grand Isle. All of these posts were built to fortify the coastal cities. Well, if you look at, or if you've ever been to a place like Fort Monroe in Norfolk or Fort Pulaski in Savannah, they're all pretty nice posts in pretty nice locations. Fort Pike and Fort Macomb and Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip and Fort Livingston were not in those great places, and therefore it was felt that they needed a more habitable logistic base to support these outlying installations, and that was the birth of Jackson Barracks. It was built in 1832 to 1836 to supply these outlying installations. Now, Jackson Barracks was never intended to be a fortified, defendable installation. After all, New Orleans was a city, Louisiana was a state, and we had these outlying fortifications to defend us in the event of some attack from an adversarial force. So it was designed as a logistics base. And I'll see if I can work this. The original construction of Jackson Barracks was roughly in the shape of a parallelogram. It followed here, across here, down here, and across. It was constructed to house 4 companies of infantry. The 4 companies were housed in these 4 buildings here, which were barracks buildings. And then the outlying buildings were on this side of the parade ground, officers' quarters, and in the back of this parallelogram were various supply installations, a prison, a storehouse, and so on. This is the outline of the original barracks. If you notice, these are the houses. There's a large house here, a large house here, and a small one here. A small one here, a large one, and a large one on a parade ground. Across the front, or the riverside, was a headquarters building and 2 guard towers. There are 2 guard towers in the back of the building, along with these appurtenant buildings in the back, and the 4 buildings that are built as company for enlisted soldiers. It's better seen there. If you notice on this building here, there's a front quadrangle, which is this area, which was a parade ground, and then a rear quadrangle here. There are 2 guard towers on the back there. That was the original Jackson Barracks. If you also notice the construction, the backs of all of the buildings along the perimeter were designed to be the walls of the post. Therefore, in all these houses, here, 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 that one, that one, that one, and these, the ground floor rear of the houses had no windows, because that was the wall of the post. Between the buildings was a 10-foot wall that joined in one continuous wall of the post. There was an opening in the rear, an opening on the north side, and then the main opening was where the headquarters building was, which is across the front. When the post was built, the river was much further out than it is now. And in front of this post was a road, a railroad, a trolley car track, and a levee. So there was a continuous amount of traffic along the levee going into this barracks. This was designed, as I said, as a replacement or logistical base. 4 companies of infantry, and farther back, after this post was built, farther back, what is now bordering St. Claude Avenue, was a powder magazine, obviously designed about 500 yards back to be away from the post to store the ammunition for these large posts, for these large installations that are outside. Jackson Barracks has a kind of a unique history to it, as I said, because it never was designed to be a defended installation, but we constructed it nevertheless as a walled installation, roughly 100 yards by 300 yards wide. Because New Orleans is where it is, the Mexican War made Jackson Barracks very, very important, because this was the major port for the shipping of our soldiers into Veracruz for the Mexican War. It's interesting to note that at Jackson Barracks, because of the Mexican War, many, many individuals who would play a prominent part in the Civil War were stationed there, although not at the same time. Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee were both stationed there as lieutenants. George McClellan, Jeb Stuart, P.G.T. Beauregard were all persons that were assigned to Jackson Barracks at one time or another. Because of the fact that Jackson Barracks played an integral part in the sending of troops to Mexico, it obviously played an important part in the return of those troops from Mexico, and many of those troops were injured. There was then a feeling that there needed to be some sort of hospital that could be built that would be a federal hospital that would support the wounded from Mexico. And in 1849, what we did is we purchased the property immediately to the north of Jackson Barracks and built a hospital. Let me give you just some of these pictures. This is the interior view of the barracks buildings. That's those 4 large buildings that were done in a rectangle up here. They were 2-story, open bay barracks, fireplaces at either end. This is a picture of the post headquarters that was constructed along the front of the river. This is a picture of one of the guard towers on the levee that was destroyed, and I'll get to why it was destroyed in a minute, but we had 4 guard towers, roughly 3 stories high, on each corner of the post. This is a picture from the 40s, probably, of Jackson Barracks. If you can see these large houses here, there's a very, very influential person who lives here. That's the Adjutant General. A less important person lives here. That's my wife and I. And these are the barracks buildings in the back. This is one of the sally ports, or gates, to the post. This one happens to be on the north side, or upriver side, and is an interesting point. This is the only remaining sally port. There were 2. The walls have since all been torn down, but this sally port still remains. The wood for the doors lasted on this sally port for about 130 years, or 120 years, and then it was decided to remove the doors for safekeeping. So they were taken down and stored in a building, which then was consumed by fire. And we lost the doors. The sally port is still standing, however, and is viewable. Well, I mentioned that we built a hospital, or we bought the land to build a hospital adjacent to, upriver from Jackson Barracks. And this is the way the hospital looked. It had 4 buildings, this one, one over here, and one where I'm standing, surrounded by an operating theater, which is taken from the French method of having wards outside and an operating theater in the middle that could be, with some degree of sterility, kept free from germs. This building, or this hospital, stayed in effect until about 1888. And by that time, it had deteriorated, and there was no need, or no perceived need, because the Public Health Service hospitals had been built, and therefore the buildings were all torn down, and we saved most of the wood to build the wooden bungalows that are on Jackson Barracks now. What's interesting about this is this was the first of the Public Health Service / Veterans Administration hospitals in the country. And other cities either had no real need for large amounts of military hospitals, or they had some civilian hospital that could handle it. So this one was the first in New Orleans, right outside your parish, that built the first of the Public Health Service hospitals. Now, following the war with Mexico, the post enjoyed a period of relative calm until the Civil War. If you remember your Civil War history, in 1860, in 1861, Louisiana seceded, but New Orleans was quickly recaptured by Admiral Farragut. So the Confederate forces took over Jackson Barracks during the Civil War for a period of approximately a year. 1862, New Orleans was recaptured by the Federal troops, and Jackson Barracks was reoccupied by U.S. troops. People ask whether there were large amounts of Confederate forces there. No, there were not. There were volunteers that were there. Obviously, there was mustering of Confederate soldiers there, but the post was in Confederate hands for a very small period of time until the Union forces recaptured the barracks. Up until that time, the barracks was known simply as the United States Barracks, sometimes the New Orleans Barracks. It was after the Civil War that the barracks was formally renamed in honor of Andrew Jackson. There was a period of a lull again. We did not participate in any great amount with the war with Spain in the Spanish-American War. And then in World War I, Jackson Barracks was used extensively as a muster station. And following World War I, General Pershing reviewed the troops at Jackson Barracks in a noted ceremony. It's interesting to note that our museum, which I will mention again at the end of this speech, our museum has a 1917 Cadillac touring vehicle that was said to be used by General Pershing. It's in driving condition, was used at a parade in Natchitoches not long ago. Following World War I, the property was declared excess by the federal government and was given to the state of Louisiana. It then became the home of the Louisiana National Guard under then Adjutant General Raymond Fleming. It became the home of the National Guard, and during that time period, it ceased to be an infantry post and became a cavalry post and an artillery post with the 141 and the 108th Cav. That brought in an awful lot of horses. So some of you that are of a certain age might remember that there were polo grounds at Jackson Barracks, and polo matches were played on weekends with visiting teams and so on with the horses that were stabled at the barracks. And an awful lot of the buildings that we use now as offices and in fact quarters were stables for those horses. When World War II occurred, again the property was taken over by the federal government and used as a port of embarkation. Before World War II, let me mention this building. This is Fleming Hall, which is the headquarters building at Jackson Barracks, and it was built by WPA during the Depression. Those of you of a certain age will remember that Huey Long had a lot of powerful connections in Washington, and he was able to get an awful lot of Works Progress Administration construction done in Louisiana. And Jackson Barracks was extensively renovated with WPA personnel. This new headquarters building was constructed, and most of the bungalows and, in fact, the old brick quarters were renovated by WPA forces during that time. World War II hit, the federal government took over the property again and used it as a port of embarkation. This is just a picture of the barracks in 1936, and you can see that there's very, very little construction back here. This is St. Claude Avenue, right along here. There. Excuse me, there is St. Claude Avenue. Very, very little construction. That's the polo field. Okay, how do I, there it goes away. This is what happened in World War II. That polo field became huge numbers of these World War II type temporary buildings that most of you men are familiar with. Two-story wooden buildings designed to last 10 years. Most of them have lasted 60. They still exist on lots and lots of posts. That was the construction in World War II and used as a port of embarkation, which is basically a mustering point. This picture was taken probably about 1949. You can see the headquarters building here. All of these wooden homes in this area were on the hospital track and were built with the wood salvaged from the hospital. Again, you see the same lineup of all the antebellum homes, which make a parallelogram, and all of the edges of the homes line up with each other. This is a picture taken somewhat later, shows a driveway that is currently around. It shows some oak trees that are no longer here. If you happen to go on the barracks now, you will see these oak trees are gone, and these little dwarf oak trees in front of the Adjutant General's houses are now about that size. This is a modern picture of Jackson Barracks, and I will get to it, explain into it when we talk about the present day. As I say, during World War II, we mentioned that it was taken over by the federal government, and after World War II, it was declared excess again. And it was given to the state, and it has remained in state hands since the end of the Second World War. There is the provision that it can be turned back over to the federal government if it's ever needed again. But if you remember the picture I had with all those temporary buildings, that space is all gone. And therefore, there's really not a lot of use that we think the federal government could ever make of this. It couldn't be used as a port of embarkation again, and therefore, we think there's very little chance that it would ever be used for military purposes by the federal government again. It has been the headquarters of the Louisiana National Guard since the end of the First World War, with that brief interruption. And that's one of the few places where you will find a National Guard headquarters not in the state capital. Logistically, this is probably not the best place for it. I guess if you wanted a capital, you put it in Baton Rouge, or if you wanted the most convenient place, you'd put it in the center of the state, say in Alexandria. But because of the tremendous opportunity for not only homes but offices, it's been our headquarters, and there's no plan to change it. We've greatly expanded the barracks itself. You will see this large building here is the new Stark Armory that was constructed in 1991. This area here was the police complex that was built as a work release facility prison and remained a prison until about 1992 or 3. Additionally, there are some state-of-the-art armories that were constructed about 1960 but extensively renovated about 10 years ago, one here and one back here. This is kind of just the last picture showing the headquarters from the headquarters building to show that although I don't think the railroad track was ever quite that close, it's an interesting photograph to show how the barracks looked at that time. It continues to be the headquarters of the Guard. Currently, the National Guard has about 11,000 Army troops and about 1,500 air troops. The headquarters is here. Additionally, we have 32 officer families that live at Jackson Barracks and about 36 enlisted families. The enlisted families generally probably live in trailers. The officers live in the houses in Area A. The barracks is designed so that Area A is that historical area closest to the river. Area B encloses that area where the work release prison was and the 141 Artillery Armory is, and then there's St. Claude Avenue. Area C is that portion between St. Claude Avenue and North Claiborne, North Robertson, and then areas E and D and E go back to the Noble School and back to the end of Florida Boulevard. We probably employ at Jackson Barracks, it varies between 600 and 650 people on a daily basis. And as I've said, most of them live in St. Bernard Parish. A few live in Metairie, a few live in the inner city, a few live on the West Bank, but I would say 75% of the people that do not live on the barracks itself live in St. Bernard Parish. We're very proud of our connection that we've had with you all. We did several years ago a house tour in connection with several of your organizations in the parish that promote nonprofit contributions to various charities, and we look forward to doing it again. I would encourage you to visit the barracks, and I'd particularly encourage you, because she won't let me drive home if I don't mention it, that you go to her museum. Sherry is the museum curator, and we think we have one of the nicest National Guard museums in the country. If you've not visited it, we encourage you to do so. We periodically have cultural events there. We've had the New Orleans Symphony perform there in the past. Some of the activities since 9/11 have stopped some of that, but we hope to continue it. We would encourage you to visit the museum. As I say, our museum is a stuff museum. The D-Day Museum is a fine, state-of-the-art museum, but it's a sort of an interactive museum. There's not a lot of stuff there. There's lots of televisions and conversations and reminiscences and stuff. If you or some of your younger children want to see stuff, then come to ours. In addition to the old Powder magazine is the museum itself, there was a 1991 edition designed to replicate the Powder magazine, and a theater that is used by lots of St. Bernardins, the Zanos particularly, and is also an air park that shows those planes flown by the Louisiana National Guard. I thank you again for supporting Jackson Barracks and being the hospitable neighbors that you all have always been. It's my hope that the people at Jackson Barracks become as hospitable neighbors as you have showed us how to be. I thank you very much.
Let's give another hand to Colonel Pugh. That was great. If I can, I'm going to present plaques to both of them. This is Colonel John Pugh, and this is Mrs. Sherry Pugh, who is the archivist and runs the museum, archivist of the library, and they are, I can attest, fantastic, both of them. So let's walk around. I'd like to thank everybody for coming, and just to remind you that the lectures are held the first Monday of each month of the school year in the Nunez Auditorium. They're free and open to the public. We invite everybody to come and bring friends. They're preceded by a fantastic wine and cheese reception, and we still afterwards have some culinary cookies left made by the Nunez Culinary Department. So once again, thanks for coming.